What makes a good ancient military commander? Should we revere them for their flashy displays of tactical brilliance on the ancient battlefield? Their ability to lead men under the heaviest of pressure and in real time deliver victory for their armies? The ability to gamble, seize opportunity in front of them, and overcome odds that did not seem possible from any standpoint? Think Caesar at Alesia or Alexander at Gaugamela. Battles won by a perfect combination of extreme gambling and flawless decision making. Well, we don't really know if today's commander had any of that capability within him. The subject of this video failed as a commander not during the battle that defined him, but in the decisions leading up to that event. When it comes to an ambush, hindsight will tell us that it is best not to find yourself ambushed in the first place. This man stands accused by the ancient sources of having shown extreme negligence and naivety, which allowed his enemies the perfect opportunity to destroy his forces entirely. Is this fair? Well, I endeavour to find out by examining what the sources say and also look at the career of this particular Roman before the disaster in question. What is not beyond doubt, though, is that the impact of this man's failure heavily affected the psyche of the ancient Romans, and is the only true blot on the history of arguably the greatest Roman, the first emperor Augustus Caesar. Today's Roman incompetent was in charge of the legions that were lost in Teutoburg Forest. Publius Quintilius Varus. Before we get stuck into the narrative, I am going to introduce the sources we have available. Some of these were writing with a fair amount of time between them and the Varian disaster. One of these big names is Suetonius. He was a historian and biographer writing around the turn of the 2nd century AD. He is chiefly known for his biographies of the 12 Caesars, which tracks the lives of Julius Caesar and the first 11 Roman emperors. This is useful to us because he wrote the biographies on both Augustus and Tiberius. And the Battle of Teutoburg Forest happened 5 years before the death of Augustus, and Tiberius was dispatched to sort out much of the aftermath in the years before he became emperor. Suetonius' account, though, is held back by his removal from the events, and also frankly a lack of detail, as he was focused on the actions of the two emperors, not on the governor of Germania. Next we have Velleius, who is probably the only real contemporary source we have that supplies any significant detail on what happened. Velleius was a senator and a historian, but during the time period we're concerned with, he actually served as a soldier under Tiberius in Germania. For whatever reason, Velleius is not well regarded by historians as a source, and it is fairly certain that he was not widely read by other later Roman historians. An interesting thing about him, historians surmise that despite professional and social proximity to Tiberius, he may well have fallen foul of the emperor during the trials of Sejanus, and that explains why no writings of his survive past that point. We also have another contemporary in Strabo. Now, Strabo was a Greek geographer who wrote a significant piece of work called Geographica. This was an encyclopedia of geographical knowledge and contained information about the tribes living in Germania around the time of the Varian disaster. Strabo wrote this treaty while the German instigator Arminius was still waging war against Germanicus and the Romans. And Strabo died in 24 AD, which is just 3 years after Arminius was poisoned by his internal enemies. One of the more favoured sources by contemporary historians is Tacitus. Publius Cornelius Tacitus was born in AD 56, and at the time he wrote his relevant works, he would have been more than 100 years removed from the events. He is, though, arguably the biggest name among the Roman historians, and considerably more trusted than the other sources we have by modern scholars. Annoyingly for me, however, he started his history at the beginning of the reign of Tiberius as emperor, so he misses writing about Varus and Teutoburg Forest in detail by about 5 years. We do, however, get a good sense from a reliable source the impact that this battle had on Rome in the years to follow. The last account that I will use is that of Lucius Cassius Dio, which in some ways is the most interesting, as it is the most detailed, in-depth account of what happened to Varus and his 3 legions. However, the drawback is that Cassius Dio wrote his history some 200 years afterwards, meaning it is the latest of the sources. It is presumed much of what he wrote is actually a literary reimagining of what happened, as opposed to an accurate record. Nevertheless, there will be some truth in it, as he had no doubt access to accounts of the disaster that have been lost to us now in the present day. The birth date that we have for Varus is 46 BC, and he was born into the Quintilia family. While a patrician by birth, the fortunes of the family had not fared too well as far as Roman nobility goes. His father had backed the senatorial faction against Julius Caesar. And following the defeat of Brutus and Cassius at the Battle of Philippi, Sextus Quintilius Varus committed suicide, as was the noble Roman tradition. Despite his father's allegiances and failure to spot a winning cause, Publius Varus' own career started particularly well. He clearly became a higher-ranking member of the faction that backed Octavian, the future Augustus. He is noted to have made the eulogy at the funeral of Marcus Agrippa in 12 BC, Agrippa being the most trusted general and right-hand man of Octavian throughout his struggle for power and war with Mark Antony. Varus was actually married to Agrippa's daughter Vipsania sometime before the general passed away, although Agrippa had 4 daughters called Vipsania, one of whom was more famous for her relationship with Tiberius, the future emperor. In 13 BC, Varus had made it to the rank of consul alongside Tiberius. Following his service as consul, he would take the usual route of becoming governor of one of Rome's many provinces. His first posting in around 8 BC was to Africa, and following this he would govern Syria between 7 BC to at least 4 BC. It is during this governorship that the sources we have available begin to take notice of him. A surprise bonus source makes an appearance at this point. The Judean-turned-Roman historian Josephus provided some historical record as to what happened when Varus had a revolt to put down in Jerusalem. The Roman client king Herod the Great, yes, the biblical Herod, as in the massacre of the innocents Herod, had passed away, and an uprising began in the wake of this. Varus occupied Jerusalem and crucified 2,000 Jewish rebels outside the city. We could say Varus proved with this that he could act swiftly and brutally to put down a potential rebellion should he need to. Velleius remarked in his account, rather dismissively though, of Varus's overall governorship of Syria. He doesn't mention this Judean revolt, but he does throw on him the accusations of mismanagement and corruption with the following comment. Varus entered the rich province a poor man, and left a rich man and the province poor. Well, while Varus was reconquering Jerusalem and stealing taxes, the Roman military all-star team of Tiberius, his brother Drusus, and another Roman commander called Ahenobarbus had been pushing the Roman frontier further and further into Germania. By the point of 7 AD, the Romans had expanded this to the extent that it warranted being classified as a new province. And on the recommendation of Tiberius, Augustus would choose Varus to be the governor of this province from 7 AD onwards. Tiberius, no longer in the region, having been through some political turmoil with Augustus by this time, was then called upon to deal with the great Illyrian revolt in the Balkans. Drusus had fallen off his horse and died from injuries in 9 BC, but his son, Germanicus, would be stationed in Illyria with Tiberius. Based on the sources, Varus was the only true military leader left in Germania, and with all the legions that could be spared to hold the region. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest occurred in September of 9 AD. Varus and his legions were en route to quell a supposed uprising, and they had moved from their permanent base near the Rhine with the full force available at a time, that full force being 3 legions, the 17th, the 18th and the 19th. While travelling in an area now called Osnabrück in Lower Saxony, they were ambushed by a large coalition of Germanic tribes. These tribes were led by Arminius. Arminius was a noble of the Germanic tribe called the Cherusci. He had served, however, in the Roman auxiliary as a commander, and was both a Roman knight and citizen. In Teutoburg Forest, he made very clear, however, where his true allegiance lay, and that was with his countrymen. The 3 legions under Varus were marching along a dirt track in country that was unfamiliar to them. Velleius described the surrounding forest as swamp-laden and extremely dense with trees. This aided the tribes as they were able to repeatedly ambush the Roman legions and disappear back into the thickets at will. Velleius did not doubt that the Roman soldiers lacked experience or fighting ability, in fact declaring that they were among the most disciplined and experienced of the troops that could have been found in the empire at that time. But they were unsuited to dealing with this sort of attack in that terrain, and most importantly, they were caught completely unprepared. The strength of the Roman legions relied on the ability to either maintain formation in open battle, or their ability to build quick fortifications to frustrate an attack. In this situation, the trees and the thick forest prevented correct formation being held, and due to the ambush they were not able to consolidate and build suitable defences. It is Cassius Dio that provides the most colour in his account, as the Romans were absolutely not ready for an attack and were mostly travelled in scattered groups, with many women and slaves from the followers' camp mingled among the soldiers in their long procession, which further added to the confusion. Additionally, the forest and swamps were proving difficult even before the attack started. Throughout the 3 days of this battle, torrential downpours of rain persisted. By this account as well, the Romans were not equipped for fighting effectively in the thick forest, as they could not make use of their javelins or style of fighting that relied on heavy infantry formations. The barbarians, though, came lightly equipped and knew the pathways through the forest. From the archaeological findings, it appears the Roman line was extremely long at the point of attack, anything up to a stretch of 20 kilometers. The Romans managed to survive the first night and threw some sort of camp together. They were heavily outnumbered, and no doubt there were many splintered groups that had not caught up with the bulk of the legions, who were picked off by the local tribes. Varus and what was left of his men tried to break through the forest towards open country. Arminius, however, trapped them near a hill where the Germans had built a wall and a trench from which to attack from cover. After failing to breach these defences, Varus committed suicide, much like his father had before him. Prior to this, Velleius tells how a legatus tried to flee with the cavalry, but was outrun by the Germans and slain. It can't really be stressed enough how much of a total loss this ambush was for the entire 3 legions were wiped out or captured. The tribal coalition had in one move wiped out essentially the entire Roman military presence in the region. This was made evident by how Arminius and his forces swept through the Roman forts after their victory, with the exception of a couple that managed to hold out. Arminius was only halted by the eventual arrival of Tiberius, fresh from victory in Illyria. So what exactly went wrong? And why was Varus to blame according to our sources? 4 of the sources give pretty much the same account of where Varus went wrong. Velleius is particularly scathing when it comes to how Varus carried himself in the province beforehand. He charges Varus with not taking his position of military command seriously enough. Instead, he allowed himself to believe he was just a Roman legislator, there to merely bring the correct application of Roman law to these barbarian subjects, not facing the reality, of course, that he was in fact an enemy commander in occupied territory. Velleius outlined that tribal leaders would bring false disputes to Varus for him to mediate on, and this was done on purpose to lull Varus into a false sense of security and show a front of cooperation and friendship. The general trend with the sources is that Varus was negligent and did not take proper care to ensure that his troops were protecting themselves. Cassius Dio notes that Varus should not have been so confident the Germans were subdued and of little threat, when in reality, the Romans did not actually hold the entire province, but instead held swathes of land connected through a series of forts. Equally, his decision to trust in Arminius and take his troops far east of the Rhine away from safety is heavily questioned. Cassius Dio also describes that as Varus went further into territory, he left troops behind at villages along the way to help with policing and thereby diluted his forces. Besides the lack of preparedness and lackadaisical leadership, the biggest bone the sources have to pick with Varus is trusting Arminius. And on top of that, failing to heed an explicit warning from a Etruscan noble called Segestes, who told Varus of the planned revolt and who the leaders would be. Some of the best information comes from Tacitus, who in defense of Segestes as a Roman ally, castigates Varus for not having believed the words of this Germanic noble. In both Tacitus and Strabo's works, we learn that Segestes was the father-in-law of Arminius. But this relation was not out of choice. Arminius had, by the Roman records at least, forced the marriage to Segestes' daughter Thesnelda, when she was originally betrothed to another man. As such, Segestes was involved in a bitter and long-running feud with Arminius, which is almost certainly why Varus was not disposed to believe him when he stepped forward to give up Arminius and his co-conspirators. Tacitus in essence places the entirety of the disaster on Varus failing to read Segestes and Arminius properly. Segestes would prove himself a loyal ally and adopted citizen of Rome, even being present as a guest of honour when his daughter and grandchild were paraded through Rome at the triumph of Germanicus, who had captured them campaigning against Arminius, and through a light skirmish campaign had managed to capture his daughter and his child. Arminius, on the other hand, proved himself one of Rome's greatest enemies. Velleius, it must be said, is very complimentary of Arminius and his talents as a commander, describing him as both bold and intelligent. In the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, Arminius would use the divide and conquer tactic, which is much easier to implement when your enemy doesn't know the area, you have perfect information on them, and their line is extremely elongated, therefore vulnerable. All faults that could be laid at the door of Varus. If we trust the sources available, we can conclude the whole mess was a result of Arminius being deceitfully brilliant, and Varus being a perfect storm of negligence and naivety. Arminius would remain a thorn in the side of the Romans until his death, and the Romans did not manage to retake the land that was lost in the aftermath of this ambush. So how did Rome react to 3 legions disappearing suddenly and a province turning on them? Not well. Suetonius describes that Augustus fell into a melancholy, and to quote a translation directly, he was so greatly affected that for several months in succession he cut neither his beard nor his hair, and sometimes he would dash his head against the door crying, Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions. And he observed the day of disaster each year as one of sorrow and mourning. Cassius Dio happily explains that Augustus's despair most likely came from the fact that Rome was suddenly rather vulnerable. Many of its legions were deployed in far-flung parts of the empire. Strategically, the loss of these legions and the forts that followed meant Arminius and his coalition were able to threaten the Gallic province, which also potentially left Italy completely undefended to the north. Equally though, Augustus' reaction probably came from him not having to deal with such defeats very much throughout his reign. After his war with Mark Antony had ended, he had faced very few military failures. The other disaster mentioned in the sources describes one Marcus Lollius, who managed to lose a whole legion. This was reported by Suetonius to have been the most disgraceful defeat suffered under Augustus, the Varus defeat being the most damaging. Sadly, there is not much information on the Lollian disaster, or I would dedicate an entire one of these videos to him. In the end, it fell to Tiberius to oversee the response to Teutoburg. He left Illyria and reinforced the Roman military position on the Gallic border with 2 legions. Much of what we can learn about the failings of Varus from Suetonius comes from how the historian praises Tiberius' command in complete contrast to the carelessness of Varus. Tiberius is shown as a paragon of diligence and, to be honest, military micromanagement. Not even a river crossing is allowed to commence without his full attention in the Suetonius account. Tiberius enforced strict discipline and did not make any moves without first consulting the local tribal leaders who remained Roman allies. Later on, when Tiberius became emperor in 14 AD, Germanicus would take over the fight against Arminius, carrying on the same battles his father Drusus had fought over 20 years prior. Tacitus even reported that Germanicus found the remains of the battlefield where Varus had made his last stand. The soldiers had been mutilated in death, and the captured officers were burnt alive as part of tribal rituals. If the sources say anything, it was this battle that had a clear impact on Roman psyche. There are 2 late mentions in Tacitus's records regarding Teutoburg Forest, one of which is a recollection of Germanicus having a nightmare where Varus appears out of the swamps and the forests of the German region. The other is, in fact, 40 years after the events, where, writing about the reign of Claudius, he talks about how Roman forces liberated some captives east of the Rhine, and the men they had liberated turned out to be survivors of the Teutoburg Forest battle. Varus, though, had clearly been a Roman of good standing. His contemporary Velleius called him a man of character and good intentions despite his failings. However, this disaster destroyed his reputation. His son was unable to have a good political career back in Rome. It is also believed by some historians that Varus was even originally included on the Areopagus, but that his likeness was destroyed, either by angry citizens in Rome, or the political leaders who felt that his inclusion was too controversial. The sources don't really give me much to mount a defence of Varus as a battlefield or provincial commander. He managed to rally what he could of his troops to survive the first day, but he could not conjure a miracle against the opportunism and forward planning of Arminius. His only real military success that we know of was putting down that revolt in Judea. His position largely seems to have come from his close ties with the Agrippa family and Tiberius, and the scant praise in the sources, which is overwhelmed by the despairing reaction to disaster that would come to be known to Roman writers as the Varian disaster, says enough about him really. Thank you for listening to me ramble on about this, and until next time, farewell.